Hello! Last year I read over 160 books, and a lot of those were audiobooks. It's one of my favorite ways to read, so today I've compiled a list of all of my favorite audiobooks to share with you. I first fell in love with audiobooks while I was in college. I read a couple audiobooks here and there before then, but I really discovered my love for this while I was in university. I ended up doing 2 different degrees in 4 years, so I was taking a lot of classes every semester. One of those degrees was an English degree, so I did have a lot of reading that I needed to get done. I had a dog, so I was spacing out my classes, so I didn't have just one big chunk of class in the middle of the day, so I was walking to and from campus at least a few times a day, and each time that walk was 15-20 minutes, so I got a good chunk of reading done on my way to and from class. I had been listening to music and then switched to listening to podcasts, and then realized that I could just get the books that I needed to read for class as audiobooks and read them on my way to and from class. And the rest is history. I fell in love with doing that, and now every walk that I take with my dogs, or when I'm just walking around the house, cleaning, doing errands, I love listening to an audiobook while I do those things. So I've become a little bit of an audiobook connoisseur, if you will. So here's the list. We have lots and lots of books on here. I have over 30 things to tell you about, so let's just get right into it. Sometimes an audiobook is just really well done, but there are certain categories and genres of books that just play really, really well as audio. One of those is nonfiction. So if you're looking to read more nonfiction or you're already a lover of nonfiction, I would highly recommend picking up some nonfiction audiobooks. I'll give you a few examples in a second, but I especially love when the nonfiction is narrated by the author, and a lot of times that is what happens. And I especially love when these are essay collections like The Anthropocene Reviewed by John Green. And this audiobook actually has an extra essay in it that has some audio qualities. It's an essay about this bird, and so you get to hear the bird call. An essay collection written by the author is incredible because it's their personal experiences, it's their writing, and you're getting to hear it in their voice. That's what I love about going to author events and hearing an author read the first chapter of their book or an excerpt from their book. It's really, really interesting to just see how they thought of it in their head and then translated that into words, and then we get to hear it kind of straight from the source. I love that feeling. So my recommendations to you for nonfiction audiobooks are The Defining Decade, which is basically a guide on how to make the most of your 20s, but not in like a gimmicky way. This is an actual professional who has a therapy practice. She's an actual therapist. She gives you case studies on people from her own practice, and we can kind of learn from their mistakes and figure out how to go about your 20s in an intentional way. Of course, we're all going to make mistakes and mess up, but she talks about how this really is the defining decade and you should be exploring lots of different things in order to kind of like set you up for the rest of your life. On a similar note, How to Not Die Alone is basically that, but all about relationships. So it talks about how to use dating apps, how to meet people in person, how to approach relationships in general, how to identify where your strengths and weaknesses are in your own attachment style and your own approach to relationships in general. The woman who wrote this, Logan Ury, she narrates the audiobook herself, and I really enjoyed hearing it from her own voice. And she's also the relationship science manager at Hinge now. She joined Hinge after she wrote this book, and I think it's really interesting to just kind of like, if you are on Hinge, to learn how the person who is doing some of the strategy for that app thinks about relationships. I am currently rereading this book and I'm getting tons and tons of knowledge on the second time around. Biased is an incredible look at implicit bias, and the way that she breaks this down is so approachable. So if this is a topic that you've been wanting to learn more about, but maybe don't feel like some literature out there is super accessible, this one is incredibly approachable. She breaks everything down, and I found it to be incredibly impactful. Invisible Women is about the gender data gap, so we're exploring ways that women have been left out of data sets or that we're not going about collecting data in the correct way in order to accurately capture women as a data set, and how the implications of that can be incredibly bad, especially as things that use data sets like AI become more prevalent today. The book doesn't go super in-depth into the AI conversation, but I do think it is a really important thing to think about now that AI is becoming such a big part of our day-to-day life. Memoirs like I'm Glad My Mom Died and Know My Name are exceptional as audiobooks. I prefer to read memoirs as audiobooks. I typically won't pick up a physical memoir unless the audiobook is not available. People are writing about their actual life, and I really prefer to hear it in their own voice. These 2 books especially are covering some really emotional topics, and I think it just hits a lot harder to hear it from the author's voice themselves. Know My Name is Chanel Miller's book about her experience being Brock Turner's victim in that Stanford sexual assault trial that was all over the news a couple of years ago. She's an incredible, incredible writer, and I really hope she continues to write more in the future. I'm so sad that this is the book that she had to write, and I really hope that she's able to write more in the future. And of course, I'm sure you've heard of I'm Glad My Mom Died. It's Jeanette McCurdy's memoir. I'm so proud of her for being able to write this book, and I would also love to pick up any other books that she chooses to publish in the future. There are a ton of education plus memoir type books like Braiding Sweetgrass and Smoke Gets in Your Eyes and Other Lessons from the Crematory. I love these types of books where we're getting to see a little bit of insight into the author's personal life while also learning about their profession. Smoke Gets in Your Eyes is about our author's experience working as a mortician, working in a crematory, and also just her personal thoughts and feelings going through that experience. Braiding Sweetgrass is this incredible collection of stories and essays and knowledge, combining Native American wisdom and our author's botany degree. Other nonfiction I loved as audiobooks include Entangled Life, Silent Earth, Averting the Insect Apocalypse, and many, many, many others. Sometimes a physical book is written in a way that makes it difficult for me to read physically, and I would put normal people into this category. I know the actual physical structure with this and the fact that Sally Rooney doesn't use quotation marks can be a little bit difficult for some people to read physically, so I find that the audiobook is really great for books like that where there's a little bit of a structural situation going on that makes it difficult to read physically. I also love audiobooks for books that are short story collections or that have multiple POVs if there's a full cast of narrators. So things like How High We Go in the Dark, which is my favorite book of last year, that is not marketed as a short story collection, but it really is a short story collection. And I really loved listening to the audiobook of this because each story was told from a different narrator. They all kind of weave together, or they're all set in the same universe, and I really loved how I could just go and take like a 20-minute walk and listen to one story and then come back with a fresh mind, a fresh narrator, and experience a different story on a different walk or cleaning my house or whatever. Same with Out There. This is another collection of short stories. This one is by Kate Folk, and all the stories are really out there and they all had different narrators, and it was just really enjoyable as an audiobook. The Passengers and The One by John Mars I think are also great as audiobooks. Both of these stories have multiple POVs and they're told by different narrators, so you get to kind of really feel like you're in the head of each character. And I find, especially when I'm reading things with multiple POVs, that sometimes the audiobooks can be confusing since you can't like flip back to the chapter to be like, okay, wait, whose perspective are we in right now? And it says, oh, this is Brock's chapter. Okay, I know who we are. But if you're listening to an audiobook and it's all the same narrator, it can be a little bit confusing. So that's why I love audiobooks with multiple POVs when there are multiple narrators for different POVs. But I've heard that some people don't like that. I would love to hear what you think about that in the comments. Narrators, multiple POVs. Do you want all one narrator or multiple narrators? I prefer multiple narrators. I also think horror is really excellent as an audiobook. I think it adds an extra layer of spooky scariness when you are actually experiencing hearing the things in your ears. Some of my favorite horror to listen to on audiobook has been The Hacienda, that had a really amazing audiobook, and I really felt super immersed in the story while listening. It's a pretty classic haunted house story. There's some witchiness, there's a hot priest, it's got it all. With both Comfort Me with Apples and When the Reckoning Comes, I think the audiobook made this really incredible sense of foreboding, and especially with Comfort Me with Apples, I actually listened to this on a lower speed than I typically would. Typically I'm reading anywhere from like 1.5 to 2.5 times speed on an audiobook, but I really loved just kind of slowing down. I think I listened to this on like 1.2 times speed just because I still couldn't do 1 times speed, it was too slow. But I did listen slower than I typically would with another book, and I think it really added to this ominous sense of something is not right, this is too perfect, and gave me that ick, that foreboding that I love when I'm reading a horror book. Cover Me with Apples is so short that I really don't think you should get much of a synopsis before reading it, but I will say that we're following this woman who's in this perfect marriage. She feels like she was made for him, and then things start to go awry. She starts to find things in the house. When the Reckoning Comes is the story of this woman who's going to her friend's wedding. They haven't really been close for a while. She's going to this wedding. The wedding is on a plantation. Something happened there with her and her friend when they were kids. And of course it's a plantation, so lots of atrocities happened there. This book really had a lot to say about celebrating an event at a plantation. The ghosts in here I was rooting for over the human characters, and I think the audiobook was so well done. The Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires was also an incredible ride. I love Grady Hendrix' writing as an audiobook, and I think this one is my favorite that I have read so far. The Southern accents combined with the horror just really worked for me in this audiobook. Accents can really make or break an audiobook for me. The Southern accents in Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires, excellent. However, Mexican Gothic I can't read as an audiobook because there's an English accent, there's an English character, and the English accent used, it's very obvious that the narrator is not English, and the English accent just, it did not work for me. My dad is English, I can't listen to a bad English accent. But also, in the writing retreat, which I just finished yesterday, which is also an incredible audiobook by the way, really adds to the sense of foreboding. There is a character in there that does a British accent and the narrator is not English. But it worked for me because she's putting on an English accent. Like, it was a bit that she was doing, like, look how posh this house is, I'm going to speak like an English person. And so I didn't mind that the accent was bad because it was supposed to be bad. It was intentionally cringy, and I think that really added an element to it as well. So writing retreat, another great rec for audiobook. Moving back to Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires for a second, there was a scene in there that made me want to throw my headphones at the ground because of how gross it was. So just a little heads up, if you are not someone who vibes well with rodents or with cockroaches, this may be an issue for you. I am not someone who likes rodents or cockroaches. Those are probably like my two biggest fears. Like, give me a snake over a roach any day. If there's a snake in the house, I can handle it. I will take the snake out. Any other bug I can handle. Roaches and rodents, absolutely not. A roach climbs in someone's ear in this book, so just a little heads up on that. Okay, my camera is overheating, so we're gonna take a 5-minute break. Welcome back. Let's chat about some funny things. Funny books are some of my favorite things to read as audio because I feel like the jokes just hit different as audio, especially because I don't always get that it's a joke if I'm reading physically, so hearing it in the audio, being able to hear the intonation and the sarcasm in someone's voice makes it a much more enjoyable experience for me. First rec for funny books is The Wisteria Society of Lady Scoundrels and The League of Gentlewomen Witches. I read both of these majority on audiobook, and even now when I go and I read, like the second book I was switching back and forth from print and audio, I'm hearing the narrator's voice in my head spoken in her accent. It was just really fun. I really enjoyed this experience. This is about lady witches and pirates. The pirates fly houses instead of sailing ships. It's very over the top, it's very absurd, it has that cheeky humor that just plays really well for me as an audiobook. Feels very similar to other cheeky books like The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which I also read on audio. Also really love hearing that humor as an audiobook. And also Guards, I really love the audiobook for this book by Terry Pratchett. There's one audiobook narrator who narrates the entire like 40 book series, and they're so good. I really want to pick up another one in this series again. Special shout out to T. Kingfisher, my favorite author. I think a lot of her work really works as an audiobook, especially I think her cozy fantasy really works as audiobooks, and especially The World of the White Rat, the Saint of Steel series, and Sword Heart are some of my favorite audiobooks of all time. If I'm ever just feeling some type of way and I'm in a reading slump and I can't find anything that I like to go back and reread one of these. They're all romances, they're funny. Saint of Steel gets a little bit dark, that whole Paladin series. I really love the banter between our love interests in this, and it's just incredible. There's animal companions, there's people being beheaded, there's men who come out of swords. It's just a good time. The last category that I have is romance. I really love to read romance as audio. I think sometimes I don't love to read books, and there are exceptions that I'll talk about later, that are really complicated, like super high fantasy can sometimes be a miss for me as audio just because there are made up words, I am confused, I don't know what people are saying, it feels like a foreign language. So sometimes slower paced romance type books can be a little bit easier as audio, and I tend to really enjoy them as audio because I can just bop around my day doing my thing, listening to people in love. Who doesn't want that? Casey McQuiston's books I love as audiobooks. The first one I read was Red, White, and Royal Blue. Then I read One Last Stop as an audiobook as well. Really loved both of those. Other audiobook romance favorites are Kiss Her Once for Me, Beach Read, and 7 Days in June. I also have some miscellaneous things that I just think the audiobooks were really well done, and they don't really fit into any of these categories. I think they were just top tier. So, The Monk and the Robot duology, I've read this physically and as audio, and I prefer the audiobook. I just absolutely loved it. The Graveyard Book book and really all of Neil Gaiman's work, I think, read very fairy tale-like, and so I prefer reading them as audiobooks because it feels like I'm a little kid and having my bedtime story read aloud to me. I just really love that experience. Same with The Girl Who Drank the Moon and The Old Man and the Sea. Stories that feel like fairy tales or allegory stories that you can imagine being told over a campfire, I think really work as audiobooks. Sometimes my neurodivergent brain can't focus on things that don't have a really fast plot if I'm reading print, but if I can listen to the audiobook and do a puzzle or something else, I can really keep my attention and enjoy them much more. Things like the Finley Donovan series, cozy mystery, cozy fantasy, I tend to really love as audiobooks. Exception to the rule about not loving high fantasy as audiobooks, I think the Mistborn audiobooks were really well done. I think The Adventures of Amina Al-Sarafi is incredibly done as an audiobook, and this one, because we're following this scribe and our badass pirate in her 40s, we're kind of getting this adventure story that Amina is telling her scribe, and we also get the scribe kind of going back and forth with Amina, and they're both having this conversation together, and I think the way that the audiobook was produced is just really well done. You can kind of hear like Amina pushing the microphone aside to be like, are you sure you want to include that in here? This doesn't make you look so good. Maybe we can leave this part out. And the scribe going, no, Amina, like just tell the story. And she's like, okay. And she goes back into it. It's this really cute back and forth, and their friendship is adorable. Kaike, I also thought was an incredible audiobook, was not confused at all. The Assassin's Apprentice series, however, I was very confused with the audiobook, had to switch to print. It's still an amazing book, really enjoyed it, just couldn't wrap my brain around all the different names for things, but didn't have that issue with Kaike for whatever reason. Okay, that's everything that I have to recommend to you. I know I didn't go super in-depth with the synopses of everything, but I just wanted to kind of give you a list of all of my favorite audiobooks. So if you're already interested in any of these and you're trying to figure out if you should pick up print or an audiobook, these are my recommendations for the ones you should choose on audio. If you want to know anything about any of these books, please just drop a question in the comments. I'm happy to answer those, of course. Also, if you have any recommendations for audiobooks that you have loved recently, I would love to hear those in the comments. Please, please, please let me know what your favorite audiobooks have been recently if you do listen to audiobooks. Okay, that's it from me. I will see you next week. I post every Sunday at 11 a.m. Eastern. If this is your first time here, I think you should check out these videos to see if you want to keep hanging out. And if you already know that we're going to be best friends, I've got a subscribe button right there. You can join our lovely little community here. I seriously love you guys so much. I love reading all of your comments. You make me smile every day. Thank you so much. We are just inching closer to that 1,000 subscriber mark, and I'm so excited to just keep making content for you guys. Okay, I will see you next time. Bye.